This video is sponsored by DxO.
Hi everyone, I'm Alistair Ben and you're watching Expressive Photography. In this video I want to cover a big topic in as short a video as I possibly can. It's how to master black and white landscape photography. Now, as I said, that's a pretty massive topic, but what I want to try and boil it down to is the essence of what black and white photography is trying to achieve. Here in 2024, it is a creative choice. It is not a limitation of the medium, unless, of course, you're shooting black and white film. But for most of us who shoot predominantly digital, black and white processing or black and white expression or black and white prints or photographs are a creative choice rather than a limitation. So if that's the case, what are the fundamentals that we need to look at? And what I've done is I've grabbed a quick image here out of my Lightroom catalog to demonstrate the attributes of black and white photography that are incredibly important. And if you can get to grips with those attributes, then you will find that your black and white photography suddenly progresses and develops in leaps and bounds. So if we jump straight into Lightroom here, this photograph was taken in the Himalaya. This is in the Everest region of Nepal on a trek up to Everest Base Camp quite a long time ago. I think this is 2010, so it's a pretty old photograph. And I've never processed this one before, predominantly because I had a lot of photographs from this particular morning, and this one just, for some reason, I don't like the color. As you can see, the shadows are very, very blue, and we do have a little bit of early morning light. But I don't feel that it works particularly well in color, but I think it might work in black and white. So one of the things I've always said here on Expressive Photography is that to master black and white photography, you need to understand color. And in this color photograph, we can see we have a lot of blue. We have a little bit of warm alpenglow light hitting the rocks there on the right hand side. There are some deep shadows in this scene, and there are some pretty bright highlights in the clouds. So we have high contrast. We already have a lot of contrast. And contrast is one of the expressions or terms that we need to get to grips with to master black and white photography. The second is luminosity. So we have contrast, the difference between the lighter tones and the darker tones. We also have contrast, the difference between the blue and the warm tones. And we also have atmospheric contrast between these beautiful peaks, these pointy mountains, and the more ethereal atmospheric sky. So 4 different types of contrast in this scene already. If we do a quick black and white conversion here, we can see that the tones sit pretty well. We have lost the color contrast, so we don't have that blue to warm transition anymore. We just have a tonal transition. But by removing all the blue out of the scene, all of a sudden the structure of this landscape becomes far more important. We are looking at these beautiful mountains and these kind of geometric shapes caused by the reflection. So this is the first thing we really need to understand with black and white photography, is that by removing color, we're instantly allowing other attributes of the photograph to be more dominant. We've taken the color away, therefore tonal differences are going to be key, and geometric and atmospheric differences are going to be key. So what I want to do here, rather than doing the black and white conversion in Lightroom, I'm going to use Nik Silver FX Pro. Now I've been using this for, it feels like forever. I do most of my black and white work in Nik. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make some simple changes here in Lightroom first. Most of the dynamic range is contained in this scene. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to lift that black point a tiny bit. We saw when we went into black and white, there was a suggestion of clipping, but I want to just contain the dynamic range of the scene a little bit better. So I'm just going to pull down the highlights a fraction. I'm going to open up those shadows purely because I think there's some really interesting detail in there, and I don't want that to get lost in a kind of muddy a muddy black and white conversion. So I think I'll open up the whole scene first, pull down the white point. We can always boost the whites and the blacks later, but in fact, I think I'm going to go in here and use the neutral, standard or neutral. I'll use neutral since everyone keeps banging on about it. And that's going to give us a super flat version of this scene. Just making sure I'm not getting any haloing. So that looks pretty much as dull as we could possibly get this photograph to look. But that can be a really good point. But I think I will just boost the saturation a little bit, purely because providing Nick with a bit of saturation to play with is going to help that black and white conversion. So there's numerous ways of opening photographs in Nick from Lightroom here. I have both 6 and Nick 7 installed on my computer. So there we have it. You can just right click, edit copy with Lightroom adjustments, nice and easy. As soon as we open this photograph in Nick, we are going to see a default conversion. This is the standard way that things happen, is we're just removing color, and this is the default conversion. We're not making any adjustments to the black and white conversion. So the image has come through relatively low contrast because that's what we put in. We'd opened up the shadows, we'd dropped the highlights. So if we want this image to become expressive and for us to master the black and white output, first of all, we have to understand what our intention is. I talked about contrast as being a really important aspect of black and white photography, as it is with color photography. But the thing that we have to appreciate is that contrast and impact are proportional. The more contrast an image has, the more impact it will have. And I think we have to balance that with our egos in terms of how much impact are we looking for beyond what is necessary. And I think that's a really important point. For those of you who haven't used Nick before, it's quite an intuitive piece of software. It feels very much like Lightroom in many ways, with most of the tools down the right hand side. I'm not going to be covering presets in this particular video, but as you can see, there are dozens and dozens of them. If you wanted to click on one of those and see what that does to your image, then of course you are free to do so. So I'm going to be starting off with the default here. The first and probably most significant change we can play with here are these color filters. Color filters are the easiest way to affect the contrast within a scene, purely because this replicates how film photography or film photographers did it by putting color filters over the front of their lenses to affect the focal length, the wavelength of the light hitting the film. If we use a blue sensor, you're going to see that all of those blue tones are lightened. We reduce contrast because we're letting more of those blue tones through. However, if I use a red filter or any of the warmer colored filters, be they yellow, orange, or indeed red, that is blocking a good chunk of that blue light, creating more contrast. I think this scene works better with a warmer filter, and therefore we're going to be using either the red, orange, or yellow. And I'm just looking at the shadow detail here and deciding which of these filters I prefer. There's not a lot in it. I'm going to use the orange filter. It's just not quite as harsh as the red filter. I can vary the strength, and if I want to increase the contrast further, you can see you can make it unbelievably horrible. I don't want to block all of these orange tones though, because then I will end up clipping the whites in my where that warmer light did exist. So as with many adjustments, be they in Lightroom, DxO, Nick, Capture One, a gentle touch is usually going to give you the best results. So I've decided on a color filter and I am happy with that. By applying that color filter, this image that was quite flat and lifeless, and if I just hit the compare button, you can see we have already added contrast to this scene just by applying the filter. And I like that. I think that's a good thing for us to do. The next thing I can do is look at the structure. I want to add atmosphere to this, or sorry, I want to make sure the atmosphere of the scene isn't lost. I want to keep that kind of distant effect of the mountains, the distant effect of the clouds. But what I can do is I can apply some structure to my shadows. And again, if I crank that up to 100, you see the shadows become very contrasty and very like clarity type of thing. So this is a structure adjustment. So as with clarity in Lightroom, it's going to add micro contrast, but we can target that micro contrast into specific areas. If I add a bunch of structure to the highlights, you can see that the clouds instantly become more detailed. I don't want to do that. I don't want my clouds to be sharp. I want my clouds to be soft and fluffy. Otherwise, ducks can't fly through them. But what I can look at is ways to maybe increase the structure a little bit in my midtones, and in particular the shadows. Adding structure to the shadows is always going to give them a sense of tactility, a sense that we can reach out and touch them. It's increasing their that hands-on feel. And again, if I do the compare, we can see that instantly the photograph is taking on a more 3D-like feel, and we're giving that sense of here and there. We're introducing a tonal and contrast transition between the closer content and the further content. And instantly, I think this scene is already looking kind of cool, and we've barely touched anything. The next thing I would do would be dealing with the relative brightness. And we do have a zone system indicator here. So you'll see that I have very few zone 0. So this is the zone system, of course, that Ansel and his companions developed quite some years ago by putting the scene into multiple zones. And you will notice that as we move through this frame, moving up through the midtones into the highlights, and we are peaking in these clouds. This peak is Amadablam, one of the most beautiful mountains in the world. We've got a little bit of peaking of zone 9 in the highlights there, and I have no zone 10. So I have nothing in this scene that is pure white, and to be honest, I don't want it. I'm happy with zone 9 being the highest that I have. So in this, I'm basically saying that there's a tiny bit of zone 0. So I don't want to darken my shadows any further. And what I might actually do is just open them up a tiny, tiny bit. I want to avoid clipping. I print a lot of my work, and clipped shadows and clipped blacks are pretty much killers for print. So I want them to be dark. I want them to be mysterious, but I don't want them to be clipped. So I'm going to open my shadows a fraction. I may push my highlights a tiny touch. Luminosity is the elixir of life for landscape photography. It's going to deliver that sense of uplifting joy. Whenever we have beautiful highlights in a scene, we are going to have somewhere for the eye to look, somewhere for the viewer to engage with the photograph. So I am going to lift my highlights a little bit here. Now I am going to look at my midtones. Midtones are incredibly important in black and white photography. We do talk about 50 Shades of Grey, and if you're into that type of thing, congratulations. But in photography, the shades of grey in those midtones are where an awful lot of black and white photography packs its punch. If I open up all the midtones, you can see the image becomes incredibly explicit. All of those shadows open up because the midtones are pulling the shadow detail up with them. The image becomes very light, very ethereal, almost overexposed in that feel. If I go the other way, the opposite happens. The image gets incredibly dark, very, very contrasty. And this is the key, one of the many keys to mastering black and white landscape photography, is to understand the impact of the decisions that you make. If you want to express yourself, you need to understand what it is you want to express and how the image works within that framework. So for me, that feels too dark and dingy. And I'm just going to play it. Feel is your best friend. Darken them and it's going to feel one way. Lighten them, it's going to feel another way. One of the mistakes that many beginner photographers make, I'm not going to say amateur, but beginner photographers make, is that they think that there is a right way to process a photograph. And I would urge you to explore and experiment. This morning, I feel that the image wants to look a certain way. If I was to approach this image at a different time of day or on a different day of the week or in a different month, depending on how I feel, I might choose a different outcome. And this is why people like Ansel Adams reworked prints year upon year upon year. If you ever doubt that, go and look at Moonrise over Hernandez, search for it on the internet, and you will see an evolution of that print that went from what it was when it was first made through to the last prints that he was making before he sadly passed away. That image evolved. And that evolution was personal choice. It was personal preference. So another key to mastering landscape photography is not to carve an image in stone. Don't believe that your representation of the photograph today has to be fixed. Do it the way you want it to be today, but allow it to change. Allow it to grow with you. So I feel like I just want to open those midtones a touch. I just feel there's so much incredible, intricate detail in this section that crushing the midtones feels to me a little bit as if it's going to kill those beautiful reflections and the kind of weird abstracts that it's making. I think for now, this works. I'm just going to click apply and that's going to take the image back into Lightroom and we can compare it with the color version. So if we compare the black and white photograph with the color version, you will see I haven't made crazy adjustments. The tonality of the raw file and the black and white version are very similar. I've opened up the shadow detail. I've made them more a part of the story of this photograph. There does definitely seem to be more depth, and I do like the black and white version. Equally, I like the color version, and I'm sure I could process that in a way that would make me happy also. But I do like this black and white version. Mastering black and white landscape photography is about understanding how the midtones are going to shape the feel of the photograph. The darker the midtones, the more moody it's going to be, but equally the way the highlights will stand out against that canvas, that darker canvas. If you go into a forest, for example, darkening the scene and allowing the leaves to be brighter is a great way of making very, very good and impactful black and white photography. So the role of contrast and its relationship with luminosity is huge. Understanding the role of color filters and how that's going to affect the dynamic range and the way that the tones are converted so that you're darkening cooler tones or lightening warmer tones depending on the filter that you're using. All of these things that I've discussed are really good ways for you to explore your relationship with black and white photography, but in particular the impact of what it is you're trying to articulate. Impact is the holy grail, I think, of contemporary landscape photography, and social media is forcing us down this line of making increasingly contrasty and impactful photographs. If they haven't got Milky Ways in them or full moons or huge amounts of contrast and clarity and impact, then people just aren't looking at them. I don't want my photographic nuance to be affected by what people want. I want it to be what I intend. I did write a book called Luminosity and Contrast, an ebook which came out in 2018, so it's 6 years old, and it's still selling today as well as it ever has. It's become a foundation course in black and white photography for thousands of landscape photographers around the world now. And that, of course, was the first part of my Expressive photography ebook series, which I followed up with The Color of Meaning and then Creativity Superpowers. Dive into our e-store and check out any of those ebooks. but also I do have a 10% discount available for the Nick Suite, which includes all of the things that Nick does: color FX, silver FX, noise cancelling, you name it. So there is a 10% discount available, and the details of that are also in the link below. Thank you for watching this. I hope you've enjoyed this little primer on how to master landscape photography in black and white, and I look forward to bringing some more content to you again shortly. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.